What is up, everyone, and welcome to episode 61 of Pull Up with Miles and Owen. Today we have a friend of the show, friend of the podcast, and frankly, one of the most overdue guests that we've had. We've been meaning to talk to him for ages on record. We talk to him at Barclays Center just about every day during the season. He's a legend. He is a staff writer for The Athletic, covering the WNBA, covering women's college basketball, and he is one of the hosts of the terrific podcast No Offseason, The Athletic's women's basketball show. Ben Pickman, my guy, how's it going?
I'm doing well. I appreciate the warm intro, but I'm guess 61. I mean, we talk every single day, as you said, Owen. It is long overdue.
Yeah, that was tough. I'm not gonna lie. I had to like balance the scales there. 60, there were 60 in front of you, and that might hurt, but I just want you to know it's not personal.
No, I'm taking it personally. So
Well, talking about taking it personally, let's jump right into the WNBA, where nothing is ever taken personally. I wanted to just kind of hit us with some early takeaways, some very small sample ideas that you have coming off of what's been going on the court, because it feels like last season just built right into this season with those teams at the top. Liberty and Lynx are the undefeated teams to start. Do you feel like we're just destined to run back that finals?
I don't necessarily think that. I mean, I think that New York has again reestablished itself very much at the top of the league. Again, number one, I think in offense and defensive rating as we tape this kind of on Wednesday afternoon or on Wednesday morning. And you see what Natasha Cloud has just brought them. And we've all been at Barclays Center a bunch and seen it firsthand. Like, not only is she a player that has, I think, shifted some of how they actually play on the court, but in terms of changing the energy of a franchise and of a team, like so often with championship repeaters or teams looking to repeat, you hear phrases about things being stale, and like her energy, her presence has made it impossible for the environment to feel stale because she just provides such juice, such energy, such life, like every time she walks in the building. So I think New York still very much a favorite as they were preseason. I think Minnesota, there's still like a little bit of question. Like I'm still trying to figure out, Kayla McBride, how she's going to, fit right back in with them. I think, their training camp, like they dealt with expectations for the first times and we saw some moments of frustration. So I'm just curious how they kind of build and progress throughout the year. I mean, Minnesota is right there. Certainly well deserved to be in the title conversation. There's no reason to take them out of it, but I'm not ready to just pencil them in, clear tier one and tier two, 2 weeks into the year.
I love what you said about Natasha Cloud because like we all factor in the basketball element, and we all know that Courtney Vandersloot was so integral to this team and is so beloved wherever she goes. And we also know that like there were slightly diminishing returns through no fault of her own. That's just how one's career arc goes last year. And we all, when Jonathan Kolb and the Liberty traded for Natasha Cloud, started thinking about the basketball of it all. And this is the perfect type of perimeter defender to add to this team. And Natasha Cloud's the perfect point guard who can get you a bucket when you need a bucket and can distribute boom, boom, boom. But it's like what you just said about the energy in a year when you're trying to repeat, I think is really important because there is that kind of thing that just sets in. It's a little bit of malaise, it's a little bit of complacency, and it's not to levels of such extreme where it's like, oh, they don't care anymore. But it's just kind of an inevitable thing of once you've reached the mountaintop to have a built-in like extra boost of like, okay, this is an infusion of the best energy type of point guard that you could possibly add. I just like the way you put that because we're seeing it, and it's like such a tough thing to quantify, but it's so huge for them. Kind of switching gears to a team that almost seems to be dealing with maybe the opposite issue. Las Vegas Aces. Ben, you are in the know. Why does this team not have a general manager? I'm going off the top right here. I did not plan to ask you this, but I just need people who know things to explain to me why a two-time champion who's been at the forefront of investment in this league decides to run their basketball operations department through a combination of head coach and team president. Is that what's happening? I don't know. And just what's your overall concern level for this team? Are we overreacting to 4 games, or is there cause for concern?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a team that is a little bit tough to figure out of how they've gotten off to this start. I mean, to your general manager executive question, I mean, from what I understand, I do think it is this partnership between Becky Hammon and Nikki Fargas, who's the team president on that side. I think it's interesting that, we have seen in recent years a shift away from head coaches having a ton of personnel decision-making power in the W. 5 or 6 years ago, there were a number of teams throughout the league who had coach GM titles, and now, Cheryl Reeve is really the only person, I guess, other than in theory Becky Hammon, who like Cheryl has this very clear front office say, which she's the president of basketball operations in Minnesota and also the head coach. Becky doesn't have that same front office title, but it's clear she has input on personnel decisions. For me, like entering the year, Jewel Lloyd was she was the number one player when we did a podcast on my most intriguing players to watch list because like for as great as she has been throughout her career, she had to do a lot last year in Seattle, and she was not very efficient doing it. I think she, had career lows or near career lows in both field goal percentage and 3-point shooting. She was not efficient, partly because she had such a high usage rate, and so I was just curious to see how she was going to fit. The other question I had though with the Aces was like depth was really, in my mind they kind of ran out of gas last year. And yeah, Chelsea Gray might not have been playing her best coming off the injury, but like up and down the roster they just didn't have enough players to compete with say New York in the semifinals. And Asia's playing a career high in minutes. She's like at the top of the league, I think the most minutes of any forward in the league last year. And to me, they still haven't solved that. Like, I know that they've retooled their bench a little bit. They've brought in Dana Evans, they brought in Crystal Bradford, but like the questions of who reliably is going to spell their core four very much remains intact. Now, that doesn't explain why they lost to Seattle in the way that they did in game, whatever, 3 or 4 of this season. But I do think when I think long term concern, like I don't know how they're solving that question, I guess, as the season progresses. I don't know which player is filling that void. Maybe it's Dana Evans playing a bigger role and they basically play like Evans, Lloyd, Gray, Young, and Wilson as a five. But like, does that solve their problem come postseason time? I'm not really sure. So I still think again the Aces were my preseason pick to get to the finals and play New York, and I'm not ready to bail on that after 2 weeks of the season. But I haven't seen anything to answer my preseason questions I had about them either. On
I think that after last season, just because we saw them be so good for so long, we took a step back and did a reset and said, okay, Chelsea needed some more time. And then we saw her go down to Unrivaled and just kill it in Miami. And we said, okay, Jackie was clearly hampered by injury by the end of last year. Let's get her healthy in the offseason. And that at down in Miami was kind of up and down with her health. But then she looked healthy in the preseason. Do you think that that is something that when you talk about a team that maybe does not have that depth that a New York or a Minnesota or I mean even an Indiana might have is just like there is no margin for error with this team because they rely so heavily on that top four?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I certainly don't think they can afford an injury. And to your point, Miles, like I had Chelsea Gray on my first team all W predictions ballot heading into the season. Like I was fully in on she's going to have this big bounce back year after a really successful, unrivaled, season. Asia Wilson was my preseason MVP take. Like, I was decently high again. Like I had them going to the finals, but you're certainly right. Like they have no margin for error. I mean, if one of those players goes down, like in their kind of core four, yeah, like you're very quickly shuffling chairs. And as Owen teed up to start this question, like when the Aces shuffle chairs, sometimes we don't know who shuffles into those chairs and backfills them, right? Or sometimes they don't get backfilled, and like that to me is this big question again as the season progresses. Like you know, they can't afford a big injury or a key absence the way that, Minnesota, I think, clearly to start the year, like they've been able to withstand Kayla McBride not being on the court. I think we're going to see with New York, like, Leonie Phoebus is not to the level, say, of a Chelsea Gray, but like, I think New York will be fine. Will be able to sustain for a couple games or a couple weeks without her. Like, and I do think they would be fine if a player like Jonquel Jones went out for 2 weeks. Like I think they have the depth roster talent wise to sustain. I don't know if Vegas has that same level of depth as you're saying, Miles. And so yeah, again, that is kind of the area of concern, and it's not something that I think gets fixed in the season.
I wanted
It's
to. Oh, go ahead,
yeah.
Owen.
No, it's funny because the whole coaches doubling as GM, like I wrote an article about this a few years ago, back when right before James Wade went to the Toronto Raptors. No controversy surrounding that whatsoever. It just everyone loved that move. But it was interesting identifying the fact that like there were six or seven, I think, coach GMs like 2 years before that, and by the time James Wade was in his final season with the Sky, it was just him and Cheryl Reeve, and because Becky wasn't doing it yet, I think it was just them too. And like it really was fascinating to watch that shift, and it felt kind of like it was a part of the WNBA's growth in a way. So it's interesting to see one of these teams go back, and it's like no one's really, certainly not me, doubting Becky Hammon's ball knowledge or
Not at all,
ability
yeah.
to make front office moves, but it's more just the question of it all that intrigues me.
Yeah, I mean, look, it goes back to this idea that the coach has a very kind of micro perspective, right? And this is true in all sports. It's not just true in the WNBA. Like they are very much trying to win the next game and figure out a way to have, success in the short term. Whereas the general manager, like it is their role to zoom out a little bit and take the more macro perspective, the long-term planning perspective, and that there are moments in which those two things there is a tension between those two ideas at certain points, and a natural tension, we should say, between like maximizing what you're trying to do in the short term versus putting yourself in the best position in the long term. And sometimes, like, it leads to this tension and leads to these power dynamics that are at play. And, I guess if you have one person calling the shots, like, maybe there isn't obviously a tension in people, but oftentimes when that is the dynamic, you see moves that are made for the short term. Now, I would also say in the WNBA, where contracts are so short, I do think there's a belief among at least, a few people that I've spoken to over the years that like you can afford to think so short term because things cycle through every year or two or three because of, again, contract lengths. But like, I don't necessarily know if I agree with that philosophy. I think the splitting of powers here and having someone keep an eye on the long term and a franchise invest in the long term, I think that's been proven to be pretty important to team success over time.
I have a more fun one here before we switch gears a little bit, because one of the many things that's so special about your coverage is you do such a great job of just all encompassing the basketball side, the business side, the big picture stuff, etc. And you approach your job so professionally. You create these relationships that are so beneficial to your readers, your listeners, etc. But I want to know, like, who does Ben Pickman just like watching play basketball in the WNBA? Because I'm someone who, like, anyone who follows me for 2 seconds, it's abundantly clear. I'm tweeting in all caps. There's just no rhyme or reason. I'm just like losing my mind. Who, when you're just let's pretend you had an off day, which is a
Sure.
great
Fun
great
exercise.
fantasy for you, I'm sure. Who are some players in the WNBA who you just really love watching or interacting with?
Okay, number one, I would say honestly, and it's a little bit selfish because it's like how I would also play pickup basketball, though I am by no means this player. I am like the worst version of this player is I love watching Alyssa Thomas play basketball.
Yes.
And it's not the trash talking necessarily or like the competitive energy. I'm not saying I do that on the court with peers of mine, but I just have such an amazing respect for a player who is so impactful when she literally cannot shoot the basketball beyond the free throw line. Like I don't think people understand just how good of a player she is, just how skilled she is that like because of physical limitations, her game is so confined to a certain space on the floor. And every single opponent knows that year after year, possession after possession. And yet she is able to, no matter how many times she is scouted, no matter what the scouting report says, get to her spots and impact the way that the game that she does, like the game the way that she does. I think it's like, it's so underrated. Like, again, she cannot shoot past the free throw line. And as someone, again, not to make it about me here, but you asked a question about me here on who, like, my game is just floaters. Like when I play pickup, it is like all junk. And it's like screening and junk. And again, like I am a nerdy journalist who like wears glasses when he still plays pickup, different pair than I'm wearing right now. Like, so again, I am not Alyssa Thomas, but like I know how hard it is for me and for her playing pro. It's like that times a million, right? And like I've long just respected that so much. So she is number one favorite player. And two, like I definitely have a soft spot, or I'm always excited to watch new international players come into the WNBA. And just like I watch, I've traveled to see some teams, EuroLeague teams in their markets. A couple years back, I went on like a 5-week trip where I went to 6 countries, and I went to go watch a ton of American players who were playing overseas at that time, and also international players, and wrote a whole bunch of stories on it for The Athletic. But even before then, like I follow international basketball, and so like I've kept a close eye on some of the talent as it comes over, and so you know, like we're taping this in the middle of the Liberty's homestand against the Golden State Valkyries. Like I've spent a bunch of time talking with a bunch of their foreign players, and like Janelle Salone has been on my radar for a while. Dominique Malonga, I started hearing about 3-4 years ago. From some international contacts that I have, like seeing those players come over to the W, like I'm always interested, intrigued, certainly early season to watch how they play.
So I've got a couple of follow-ups here. I could go
Yep.
towards the Asia Subway take where she said you had to have played basketball to cover basketball, and kind of just quickly I want to hear your takes on that because I think it's an interesting conversation just given the context of how so many people are just going to let takes fly from the hip, and sometimes you're just like, wait, that doesn't actually make sense when you're talking about basketball. So I just wanted to hear what you had to say to that with your Ben Pickman, Alyssa Thomas comp.
Oh yeah, well I am again by no means did not play at a very high level. Don't get it twisted here. I just played a weekly pickup run here in New York City. I mean, no, I don't agree with that take. I think we have seen across sports that there are plenty of really really smart people who are able to do the prep, do the work, build contacts, um, understand the game having not played it. Do I think in some people's perspectives, is there a benefit? Like, and do we look to some people who have played in certain moments? Absolutely. And there are topics that like I will never understand that a player in the who played in the W or the NBA played on. That's definitely true, but I don't think it's this rule by any means that like you have to have played a sport to then have an opinion about it, even an educated opinion.
Totally. I'm with you there. I think that it definitely helps with some of the day to day when you're at a practice and helping to understand what's going on with play design and stuff like that. But I feel like the relationship building is the most important aspect of this. And we wanted to talk to you a little bit about that specifically. But to back up and just talk about what your journalism journey was, because you talked about already that those weeks that you went overseas, and that was one of the coolest projects. And for me, it was just seeing that level of investment a couple of years ago before we saw the Caitlin Clark, the Angel Reese infusion of capital, of excitement, of just media buy-in. You were already on the ground overseas doing stuff like that. How'd you get into women's basketball specifically? And how quickly did that become a passion of yours?
Women's basketball or overseas basketball?
Women's basketball, which I'm sure everything will tie together at some point.
Sure, right, exactly. Yeah, so I've been at the Athletic, I guess it'll be 3 years this fall. And before that I had spent, I want to say 4-ish years, maybe a little more at Sports Illustrated. And I had done a variety of different roles there. And, at the time I was at SI, like we didn't have anyone who was covering women's basketball full time. And we had kind of been, I had been there at this period of flux, frankly. Like they had a big mass layoff, maybe 10 months into my tenure there. They had other layoffs when the pandemic started as well. And so there was just kind of a void for like people to do like there were still so many really talented people there, but it was also like if you had good ideas, you could just pitch them and do them. And for that is like it's an amazing like thing to have as a journalist who's like a creative thinker and just wants to do really good work. Like if you just had an idea and it was a good enough idea and you could make it happen, like they would green light it and let you run with it, right? And so like I have always been a really big basketball fan follower. I covered both men's and women's college basketball when I was in college. Have watched the sport since I was a kid, both NBA, some WNBA, a little less college on both sides, but alas. And so like I just looked at it as like here's a sport I'm really interested in. With more importantly, like stories that are sitting there waiting to be told. Like just really, really good stories that like they're just there. They're like in the ether. And I have ideas that I just want to explore and no one was doing them. And so it was like, why can't I pitch these ideas and explore them and dive into the space and just like try and write really good stories in a space that again was still pretty undercovered at that time. And so I just started to pitch, one story after another. About all different kinds of things. I went to Cheney State University, which was like the first and only HBCU ever to make the women's Final Four. And I wrote this big story for their 40th anniversary of that tournament run, where like the program didn't exist 40 years later. And I wrote this big story about that history and that team. It was coached by C. Vivian Stringer, a Hall of Famer. It had some notables like Yolanda Laney, the mother of Benigel Laney Hamilton of the Liberty. Always bring it back there for you guys. And I just pitched stories like that, and like they would get green lit and they would run, and I would just keep going, next one, and next one, next one. And I just started to build contacts and really dive even more into the space. And that was kind of the jumping off point for me to continue to do it. This will be I think my fifth finals in person come this fall. So
Do you have a favorite? Because that's such a cool story. Do you have a favorite piece that you've worked on? Something that, like you said, you have this creative space to pitch, and I don't know if that's still true to the same extent, but that you've built up your resume to this point where you have a lot of just faith, I'm sure, from your bosses still. Do you have a favorite exercise or interview or just project that you've worked on?
yeah, I mean, in terms of stories, like the Cheney State story always resonates. And I still get messages from like those players, years later. And when they made the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame, like they all texted me. I reached out to them. Like, that's obviously kind of rewarding to see. And you just have the relationship carry on. Like that's, this is a relationship business and a relationship, like relationships are so important. And so like those players still tell me how appreciative they are of like me bringing their story back to life in the way that I did. Um, I did a story again at my time at SI on AD Durr, who was a New York Liberty guard, the number 2 pick of the draft, I want to say in 2018, 19, out of
19.
Louisville.
Oh,
And I dealt with, and they dealt with long haul COVID. And that basically changed the whole course of their career. But also in the course of reporting that story, I was going to write like a long haul COVID comeback story. And they started to open up to me about like their reflections of their own like gender identity. And so, I spent a bunch of time talking with them just about how, you know, being out and away from basketball changed how they viewed themselves. And like that was a really important story for me. It was like one of those pieces. I think it got honorable mention in the best American sports writing that year, which was a pretty cool honor. So those are like some early stories that resonate. And then in terms of projects, Miles, like going overseas, that was kind of the first assignment. Like I tell people all the time, like I peaked in terms of assignments right away at The Athletic. My first assignment basically was like go away for 5 weeks, plan a trip, write a whole bunch of stories. I think I ended up writing like maybe 20 stories about international basketball. But it was like go put a trip together, go to these wherever you basically want to go, just scout out interesting stories, meet interesting people, and like bring that back. And so I'm really proud of like the collection of stories that I did. That project was called No Offseason. That's kind of where we get the name from for the podcast. It comes back to that project of like players going overseas. And so like, there on that project, I met a lot of American players, WNBA players, the like Tiffany Hayes, Bree Jones, Alyssa Thomas. Who else did I like? Players who were playing at Fenerbahce at the time. Kayla McBride was there. Lots of WNBA. Ryan Howard was in Italy. Marina Mabry. I met lots of WNBA players that people know and like would get coffees and meals with them and just sit and like talk basketball and talk life and talk about their experiences overseas. But also, like, I met tons of international people who like we just wouldn't know about, right? So one of the two that stick out in my mind was the coach of who she just retired at Prague. Her name was Natalia Hejkova, and she's one of the best coaches in the history of Europe. She coached Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird in Russia at one point. She's like uh, she just won another EuroLeague title, but like she's this like really creative basketball thinker. I had someone describe her to me as like the Pat Summit of Europe, basically. And so to like talk with her and write a profile on her and see her teach a practice where like they started out playing soccer, like as a team building exercise. Again, like with a little foam ball, like we were in a gym class. So watching that, or like when I was in Israel, I met a fan, like a super fan, who basically became like a fixer. He would help people like find translators, rent cars, give restaurant recommendations. Like all these people, like he was this person who pretty much everyone knew, and he was important in that basketball context. And players knew who he was, but we would never know who he was here. So like meeting some of those people, and I know I'm rambling a little bit, like that was kind of the fun of that project for me, coupled with all the travel I did.
We could listen to you ramble all day. It's like this is the now it's like journalism shop talk where I've got like 10 bazillion follow-ups.
Sure.
And this is why we
Fire
wait
away.
till episode 61, Ben, is because we knew we could do 5 hours. I got
Fire
so many
away.
places I want to follow. It's so cool to hear you talk about your journey though, and all the like the it really is, it cannot be overstated the number of amazing pieces you've written. I had totally forgotten about that AD piece, and it was such a phenomenal one. And I think like I can speak for Miles, and that definitely resonates with us in that the reason we got into this was basically the same. It was like there are all these stories here that, like you said, are in the ether. Like I want to dive into some of these, and in men's sports, we'd have had 7 different features of different varieties on so many different things, so I appreciate your perspective in that because you've just succeeded so tremendously with actually following through on that and telling those stories. How do you approach like building relationships? Because anyone who sees you, pregame at a Liberty game, it's like you're running the place. You strike a perfect balance of the actual journalism of it all, but also like it can be so stilted between media and players, and there's this weird awkwardness and whatever. And like Miles and I are always talking about how like we're all just people. Maybe just go up and talk to someone like they're a person, and you're someone who clearly believes in that and does that, and it's reflected in your work. What's your whole stance, viewpoint, and how do you approach that?
Well, first of all, I try and be a little under the radar, Owen. So I appreciate the compliment, but also I guess I need to be a little more sly as to who I'm talking to pregame
Blowing
as
up
I
your
maneuver
spot.
around the
Yeah,
room. Yeah.
that we do that on this podcast.
I guess relationship building, like you're right, it is so important. And there isn't like one, I don't think there's like one best way to do it, but I do just try and like connect with people, just about how they're doing, about their backgrounds, about their experiences. Like, I think when I do interviews with people sometimes, like especially as I'm getting to know them, I try and find and come up with ways of like just interesting forms of connection that will help me become more memorable in the future conversation, right? So like if I've been to again like a foreign city or know a team or know someone at a team where someone else played, like just a little piece of information or question that they might not normally get asked after an interview or before an interview. Like I try and sprinkle that in just because like I'm curious. Like again, it all stems from being genuinely curious and wanting to just like make connections. Um, and I will just use that as a jumping off point. And like that's something that they know the next time they talk to me, like, oh, we can talk about this, and I'm just wanna, I don't know if we can swear on this podcast, but
Oh, we can.
like,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, just like shoot the shit about like what's going on in Europe or their college or anything like that. I think the other thing, like I'm not in it for the short term here. Like, I hate when people ask, like, where do I want to be in 20 years or 30 years? But, like, I don't view this as an exit ramp. And I'm not, like, trying to get off the highway right now. And so, like, for me, I just try and again like maintain relationships as much as I can, um, because like the basketball space, whether it's the WNBA space, whether it's the NBA space, whether you know the kind of the ancillary spaces like around it in terms of brands, partnerships, companies, like it's very small and people really do know each other. And so like I'm not trying to go anywhere and I'm also not trying to like get anything exclusively for like next week. Like I'm really just trying to learn and maintain those relationships over time. I do also think like, and this is a little bit more like journalism 101y, like I benefit from one, like I am one of the few people in this space who does this as their full-time job, right? So like it is a big part of my job to show up at shoot around and when very few people are there usually, and like that is a really good opportunity for me to relationship build. When I go to games, I don't have to write off of every game. And so like I don't have the stress necessarily that some people might have, 90 minutes before the game or 2 hours, an hour after the game of like having to be on deadline and file and copy. There are games in which I do have to do that, certainly, but like oftentimes I go to, we'll say a Liberty game, for instance, and I use it as an opportunity more than anything else just to like check in with people who I know are going to be in the arena. And whether that's a quick hello, whether that's a 1 minute conversation, whether it's a 5 minute conversation, whether it's a 30-minute conversation, like, that's an opportunity for me and for them just to, again, like continue to relationship build, continue to connect. And that's one of the benefits that I recognize that I have, the luxuries that I have as a result of covering the league nationally and not having to like only worry about, the score line of that day. I'm aware of that. But yeah, that is another thing that, it means I try really hard then when I'm in person to take advantage of the opportunities and see the people that, I just want to connect with. So
I think that that's really important advice because people ask all the time, especially young journalists or people that are fans of the W and are trying to make that jump, that they ask all the time, like, what can I do? What's the way to make to start to build my footprint in this space? And it starts with that. It starts very simply with attendance. For
yeah,
so long, this league has been undercovered, underappreciated, and a lot of the people that come into the space view it as this transaction towards something else, whether it's going into the NBA or into a different sport. They're just kind of getting some experience here and moving on. And these players recognize when you're there consistently. They
sure.
recognize when you're at shoot around, when you're at practice, at the games. But they're so grateful knowing that most of us, I know that you're not in this category, but knowing that most of us, when they see at a road game, it's because we paid out of our own pocket to be there. And they understand to at least some level what the faith in the product, what the faith in them, what the kind of the burdens sometimes on media for that storytelling can be because at the end of the day, that's what it's about, right? It's about writing those stories that no one else is writing. It's about telling those stories that have gone. We've lost so much history in women's basketball just because there was nobody on the ground to do it. So I think it's really important for if anyone's listening that wants to get into this space, just to keep that in mind. And the other thing that we've said kind of over and over on this conversation, which you've on this podcast and in this conversation you've alluded to is the importance of listening when you're
Yeah.
interviewing, where it's not just a one-way street. And I think that that's something that you do so well, and especially in the context of a big scrum of a dozen people, which we in New York we can have up to 30 surrounding a poor player, and you'll come in there every time with something fresh and with something that you can read the interaction, you can read the room and say, okay, a player is being hammered on this one specific point. I don't need to get this same quote for the eighth time in a row. Let me kind of diffuse that by going in a different direction. And I feel like that's all tied into some of that relationship building. But how actively do you think about that, or how much of that is just kind of reps for you? And at this point, you're just kind of, I don't know, you've got that dexterity, that conversational dexterity.
I mean, it's definitely both. Like, I definitely am very intentional about, yeah, trying to listen in scrums or in press conferences to see like what has been said, what has been answered, but also like what room is there to kind of push an answer forward? And I think it's the kind of thing like, you know, I always look for specifics and details and anecdotes, right? Like when I try and report things out. And I think those are some of the things that really bring stories to life, right? And I maybe it's coming from, when I was at SI, like some of the best stories I would read, like were not quote heavy stories at all, right? And so if you're gonna write a story that isn't quote heavy, then you like sure as hell better have good details and good anecdotes and like good scenes. Because you can't just rely on like kind of you know, filler words or just like kind of vanilla quotes to get you to whatever word count you want to hit, right? It kind of pushes you as a reporter. And so, yeah, when I sit in press conference, I often like will listen for an answer and see, what a player or a coach has said, and then try and follow up and be like, you have just said this. Like, can you provide a specific story or an anecdote that explains this or that, comes to mind when you're talking about um, your coaching philosophy or adjustments you need to be made. It's like, well, what adjustments need to be made? And sometimes you ask the follow-up question and you just get the vanilla answer back. And that's like part of it. Like I'm not saying it gets you a good or something that's amazing every time, but I do think it like helps push it forward. And I do think people like appreciate that you're not just there to ask the question that like you entered the press conference ask like wanting to ask. Like I very rarely go into a scrum, I would say, and say like I must ask this question. Oftentimes there are a few things I am curious to learn about. And then I will kind of see what is asked and where things take like where things go. But I do think again to your point, Miles, like yeah, listening and just like having a normal conversation is so important. And to your point too about showing up, like, that is like that also can't be overstated. And again, I recognize that like I do have this full-time job. I live pretty close to Barclays Center, so it makes it pretty convenient when I go to, either Liberty practice or I see away teams practice. Like it's not a big like hindrance on my day to day. But over time, like even if you haven't had a long conversation with a player before, like they see your face, your name, your voice, and if you treat them professionally, like high level professional athletes, like I think people treat you professionally back, right? Like, and I think it shows. Like, I recently went down to Atlanta and did a story on Brittany Griner in the Dream. Like, I had never sat down for an extended period of time with BG before, but I have like been at lots and lots of scrums, press conferences, um, just like post game, pre games over the years that she recognized who I was. We kind of again like just chatted a little bit before we even jumped into a formal conversation on the record. Like, and after the fact, I think we had like a pretty good conversation. And I think the story shows that like she was pretty reflective on her experience out of Phoenix and joining the Dream. So like, now the next time I see her, I'm sure the interaction will be, the relationship is even stronger because like now we spent a little bit more of an extended period of time together, right? And that is often the case on a lot of stories I work on where it's like um, showing up and then maybe I sit down for 15, 20, 25 minutes, 30 minutes with someone and that will like serve me the rest of like my career, I guess, or my time in the league and with a player's time in the league. Like there are plenty of examples like that where I've just done like one-off stories that um, have kind of carried me throughout then into the present day. Well beyond the life of just like a one night story.
Mhm.
We want to kind of close with one final big picture topic before you guys go to Barclays Center and I stare at a Google Doc. Uh, and that is the CBA stuff. You just wrote a fantastic piece regarding it, and you've been doing so much reporting on the matter. And I just kind of wanted to ask you because we have such a wide spectrum of listeners, I think, that span from the diehards to people who are just supportive of us or enjoy the league but don't really know the day-to-day details of some of these negotiations. Like where do things stand? What would you give as an overview to someone who maybe is not kind of up on the day-to-day reporting of the league in terms of what this means because we get so much vague, you know, messaging surrounding it of, oh, we know this is a big moment for the league. They better capitalize. Players Association better capitalize. But like, what's actually happening?
It's a good question, and I will then, I guess, plug our podcast where we did an episode last week, diving into this at, like, we talked about it for, I want to say 45 minutes. So I'm going to try and distill all that down into a much shorter answer, Owen. Um, yeah, I mean, this CBA is like, this is the story that is hovering over the entire season. It is a story that everyone is talking about, teams, players, agents, league executives, like every party, because, like, in short, women's basketball is on this significant rise. We all see the record TV ratings, the merchandise sales, the attendance, just the general popularity of the sport. And yet, like, players would say that they have not equivalently benefited just yet from the recent boom. And so the CBA is basically a collectively bargained legal document in which parameters of the league are mapped out. And that ranges from salaries, right? That's obviously going to be an important piece of this negotiation to, um, you know, codifying work standards, right? That's something that the players really want. So that means, like, putting, in legal writing more concrete detail about travel, about facility requirements, about support staff requirements potentially, things like that. Like, those can be collectively bargained, and those are some of the things that the players are trying to talk about at these tables. Now, in terms of the timeline question, like, uh, Terry Jackson, the head of the WNBPA, like when I talked to her, um, you know, they say that they are negotiating with the league. Neko Gumike said they're like she's content with the process and where they want to be. She said they're right on schedule with where they want to be. Brianna Stewart said they're still in preliminary talks. Terry to me said they want to see significant progress made on the deal by mid-July and have a deal finalized or close to being finalized by the end of this season. So that's like mid-October, late October. So we'll see if that happens. But again, there's this like push and pull of, like, the league is at this very important moment. And both the PA and people from the WNBA say they want this to be a transformational document. But the question is, like, how much do things actually transform? How much will they actually change? And that is really what the two sides are talking about right now. Again, if I can throw one other data point, like, last week, I reported first that the Liberty were now valued at $450 million. Like, that's significantly up from when the Tsai family purchased the team. When Claire Wusai had told me it was a distressed asset, that's 2019. There was then a CBA that was signed in 2020 that made, some significant strides forward in the league. It doubled salaries, for instance. It changed some player living situations. But, like, now you go from, valuations that are in the fives, tens, whatever million to a $450 million franchise. That's obviously significant from the ownership standpoint. The players have not received that, like, proportional jump. And so that's really, again, like, what these sides are kind of talking about when they come to the table.
Uh, I wanted to follow up with Terry Jackson because you talked about her both in that piece and obviously Terry has been instrumental in this whole process. But she talked about the media rights deal, the media rights negotiation, and how that's all built
Sure.
in because the players do have this leverage now in that all these numbers are blowing up. And this is the worst possible time in league history for a stoppage if you're looking at this from the perspective of this is now becoming a profitable enterprise as opposed to this is going to die if we have a work stoppage. So, like, it is a different mentality than maybe it's been in the past. I think NECA's spoken about that too, where she said, like, the last CBA, we're trying to survive and now we're trying to thrive. Like, there's a different mentality going into this. But what have you learned about that media rights? Because when you talk about the players getting their slice of the pie, that is really where the money is coming from.
Sure. I mean, the media rights deal that the WNBA has coming into effect I guess next year it'll be a new deal that's around $200 million in value. They also, have the option to, or they will again sign these smaller deals. That is like the Ion deal or the CBS deal. Those are current partners that say the WNBA has for some of its media rights that the NBA doesn't. We should say that 200 million number really comes from, again, the same partners that the NBA also has. So think like ESPN, ABC. Next year it will be NBC, Amazon, etc. As kind of your main partners. Media rights is definitely the key revenue driver. And so it will be interesting to see, like, over the next couple years, how that deal gets, um, you know, how the jump in media rights valuation then impacts the jump in salary, and some of the other player experience levers that players want. To your question, Miles, about like work stoppage, um, yeah, like players have said that they want to get this deal done, that they have time on their side, that they're trying to get a deal done, but that like they're not ruling out the possibility of a work stoppage. And for me, one of the most interesting questions here, and I think it's like it's just kind of the reality is like there's a really interesting PR like dynamic question. I don't know what the right word is at play right now because like if you're an owner, do you want to be like an owner that basically like plays a role in halting potentially like this very popular growing um sport, right? That fans, way more fans than ever before, are clamoring to. And do you want to be this person in an era where, so many people and brands talk about supporting women's sports? Like, do you want to be someone who says, yeah, but like I think the maximum salary should be one point, right? It should be 900,000 and not 1.2 million, right? Like, is that again, this is an oversimplification, but is that hypothetical delta the difference? Is it worth the potential PR hit? And so I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it speaks to why a little bit why some of the players have more leverage than they've ever had before. It's not just because of the changing business, but I also think it's from a PR standpoint, like again, like more people care than ever before, more fans care than ever before. They're engaged. They care about their favorite teams, their favorite players. Um, and I'm sure they sure as hell wouldn't want a work stoppage and to miss games next May if it was over again like 50,000, 100,000, $200,000, say. And because what is that money really to a billionaire? Easy for me to say from my seat, easy for you guys to say from your seats. We don't have that kind of money. Well, like we're not in those business meetings, but I think that's an interesting thought experiment to toss out too.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Owen, I know you had something, but I just wanted to, before we outro here, also just bring up that 1031 is the opt out is the final date. So it's not the end of this calendar year. It's basically like right after the finals wrap. So that is what everyone's working to, and that I think does tie into why so much of this conversation is going to permeate throughout the entire season is because there is a real looming deadline here. They don't have time to not play basketball and focus on the CBA.
And I can before Owen chimes in, like, and I will just say why that 1031 is also important is because you're going to have two expansion teams coming in December, well, likely December expansion draft if they follow the same calendar they did last year. So like, what are the rules? What's the framework for that draft? And then you have a free agency in which like the whole league's a free agent basically. All these veterans are all free agents, and so what is the framework for salaries that these players are operating under when they make these decisions in January and February. So like, yeah, a work stoppage might not, even if it goes on, it might not lead to a loss in games, but it could potentially push the process back. And I don't think players necessarily want that either.
some might say for you, Ben Pickman, there is no off season, but I'm just gonna leave it there. I'm just gonna leave it there. We appreciate you so much. This has been so fun. I think you talked earlier about painting the scene in stories, anecdotes, details. The scene that I'm taking from this podcast is I'm picturing Ben Pickman running pickup at his local YMCA, local playground, and just grabbing a rebound in transition and bodies just flying off of him as he leads the break, Alyssa Thomas style. That's really that's what you gifted us, and we appreciate you.
I'm honored that that is the picture that I have painted. Hopefully, it's the only thing that I've mischaracterized throughout this process.
No,
Thanks
for
so
real
much,
though,
Ben.
we appreciate you so much, and yeah, I've said I don't want to belabor the point, but your work is so exceptional. We appreciate your friendship, and thanks for the time, man.
Thanks so
Thanks a lot
much,
for having me,
Ben.
guys.